Hello again, everyone. My name is Dan Puterbaugh. I'm with Adobe. We are here in the Adobe think tank at the New York Times New Work Conference here in Half Moon Bay, California, where, as you may note from the slightly goth lighting that we are serving up, we are actually in the middle of a power outage. But we're going to soldier ahead as best we can. I'm joined today by Frida Polli, who's the founder and CEO of Pymetrics. We're going to be talking a little bit about how Pymetrics is sort of changing the workplace and looking at new issues there. Now, first, you have a really interesting background, and I think what Pymetrics does is super fascinating for some reasons that we talked about prior to the interview. Yeah. But do you just want to just quickly encapsulate what Pymetrics is about and what it's seeking to accomplish?
Yeah, absolutely. So Pymetrics is a platform that uses behavioral science and artificial intelligence to help everyone find their best fit in the world of work. We do that primarily by selling our software to companies that are doing, large amounts of hiring, internal mobility, and so on. But the net benefit actually also accrues to the job seeker because, unlike most hiring tools, we actually optimize for the job seeker as well, meaning that we not only evaluate them for the role that they're applying to, we also evaluate them for any role at the company that they may be well suited for, and actually outside of the company that they originally applied to. So we really try to transfer that benefit of finding your optimal fit to the job seeker, while obviously providing benefits to employers in terms of getting the best fit people in seat.
Right, so the really crude version of that is...
It's like a Harry Potter sorting hat, essentially. Think of it that way, right? So we're really trying to make sure that the match between people and their career or their role in a company is best fit. And instead of just doing a one-to-one mapping, we're really evaluating people's fit across a whole variety of roles and sorting them or recommending the roles that are the best suited for them.
Right, and I wish sorting hat wasn't such an absolutely perfect way to explain that to me, but it's quite effective. Yeah. The reason that I found this so fascinating, as we talked about, is I went to law school. I was trained as a lawyer, and lawyers are famous for the fact that a lot of people that go to law school sort of are not quite sure what they want to do, and they come out and immediately discover that they hate being a lawyer. Yes. and it really sounds like this is designed to at least curb that. Yeah. Which I think is laudable, given the number of my sort of peers and colleagues that found themselves a bit adrift and looking for something new to do. Yeah. So obviously, when you're sort of trying to use AI to determine where people should go, what they'll be good at. No huge surprise or headlines here, but a lot of the data that you would have to work with is going to bias towards people who look like me, white males. Yep. And so how do you solve for that? I think there are characteristics that perhaps you would want to be correcting for a bit there. Yeah. I think a lot of organizations are very white male and probably could really stand to be much less so. So how do you handle that as far as the data sets?
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, again, it's not only a, in quotes, white male problem. It is that certain occupations, currently have an overrepresentation of a certain gender or ethnicity, right? What's super interesting is that if you actually look at that over time, that has changed. So doctors used to be quite male as a profession. Now it's about 50-50, right? So these things evolve. Software engineering didn't used to be as male as it is now, right? So these things evolve over time for a variety of reasons, which we won't get into. But if you take a snapshot, like you said, of a profession at any given time, it's quite likely that there will be gender ethnic bias, right? So what do you do about that, right? And so I think that this is a problem that's present in any AI platform that's using present day or historical data to make to train their algorithms on, right? So you could think like criminal justice, education. There are lots of problems where if you just take a snapshot of what's happening now, you may just then end up replicating these biases. So there are really two things that we do differently. So the first thing that we do is ensure that the data set that we're using for our modeling is as unbiased as possible. And so what I mean by that is if you look at a resume, for example, a resume is very hard to unbias because men and women play different sports, they have different extracurricular interests, blah, blah, blah. And so if you remove all of that data, you're left with not much at all to train your algorithms on, right? What we do in the behavioral sciences is we've leveraged tools. Right now we use activities that you do on the computer that look at different cognitive and emotional and social traits, but there's all sorts of other behavioral data that we're leveraging. And what we do is we only take traits that we know do not differ between men and women. And a lot of times when I speak about this, people are like, oh my God, or men and women in different gender and ethnicities as well. And people are always surprised, like, oh, is there really that much data where there aren't any differences? And we're like, actually, yes, there is, you know what I mean? So I think that just educating people that this data is out there is important. And then the second thing we do is once we built an algorithm, we actually basically look for what we call the least biased, most predictive alternative. So when we create a model, it's not one model, it's hundreds of models. And then we're searching that output for the one that shows no statistical difference between genders and ethnicities and is still predictive. So it's really a two-part process of ensuring that the data that we're actually using is as unbiased as possible, and then that the output is unbiased. To give you a very sort of like basic layman's example, right? There are more men named John in the Fortune 500 CEO set than there are women, right? So depending on the data you use, you're gonna skew one way or another. If you took name, which you wouldn't, but hypothetically if you did, you'd obviously create an algorithm that was just gonna give you more Johns, right? And there would be, fewer and fewer women. That's sort of the layman's equivalent of a resume, right? Is using sort of historical data or data that is easily accessible. If you then went to say, what are the common cognitive and emotional attributes of the men that were successful and the women, that data set is much more likely to find the things that are common and similar between men and women and people of different ethnic backgrounds than it is to look for societally induced differences like names. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
So that's how we do it.
So how do you, in looking at, as you referenced resumes, how do you look at a resume and sort of
We don't look at resumes. So that's the thing. We don't use that at all as a data set. And so that's kind of what I'm, one of the main core features of the Pymetrics platform is that we do all of our modeling based on your inherent aptitude in terms of cognitive, social, and emotional attributes, right? So for example, we'll look at how attentive somebody is, right? Lawyers, software engineers, accountants tend to be quite attentive. That shouldn't surprise anybody, right? Because, it makes sense. You have to read lots of things and be very detail-oriented. There are lots of other professions where that's not necessarily actually adaptive. So salespeople, for example, are typically not very attentive to detail. I'm generalizing here, but I'm giving you an example of what we would look at. A trait, it's called, a measure, a behavioral measure of attention that will differ depending on your suitability for different roles. Does that make sense? And we measure, 90 plus of them. So across all of those attributes, we can then come up with a profile that says, hey, Dan, based on your aggregate profile, these are some things that you seem to be better suited for than not as well suited for.
And so do you, I've occasionally run into people, just because I find this sort of fascinating, who say, yes, I am good at this thing, which might be great for an employer.
But I don't like it.
But I don't like it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how are you sort of solving for that distinction? Because if you're trying to both give the, if you're trying to give the employer, someone that's going to be effective in the role, and also a fulfilling role for that person. I mean, the person who's good at something that they don't enjoy, they might do it for a while. Hopefully they won't do it for an entire career. At some point, they're going to switch away. So how do you think about balancing those needs?
Absolutely. So, I think, so it's interesting because there's really there are three facets to what makes somebody successful, right? One is obviously their inherent aptitude for something, which is what we're talking about here. The second is some level of experience. This is more and more important as people become, more established in their career. And then once you switch jobs, that becomes essentially irrelevant all over again, right? I mean, if I look at myself, I was a neuroscientist that spent 10 years at Harvard and MIT, and then I became an entrepreneur. There are not that many people that make that switch. And so obviously at that point, at that juncture in life, my actual previous history became very irrelevant to what I was going to do successfully in the future. And the third thing, which you're talking about, is interests and motivations, right? Those are kind of the three buckets of things. So aptitude, experience, and interest and motivation. Right now, our system assumes, hopefully somewhat correctly, that if you've applied for a particular role, or we recommend a role to you and you apply for it, that is showing some level of interest. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Interest and motivation. Now, so I do think that that's the primary way that we do it. There are other things that we're thinking about developing in the future that give us a separate read on that. But I think you bring up a really good point. And right now, we're basically using somebody's self-declared interests to make that judgment.
Interesting.
Yep.
Yeah.
And again, those can be flawed because you may not know enough about, a certain career to know whether you actually would be interested in it. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
And your perception of that career may also be, biased to some extent, right? I mean, so one of the things that we found, I guess all I'm trying to say is interest is a funny thing because I believe that there's signal there. So when I was a career switcher, part of what motivated me was like, I want to be an entrepreneur. And I'd never been an entrepreneur. I had no idea what that was like, blah, blah, but I just had gathered enough information and there was something about the occupation that I was like, that really I felt very passionate about, right? However, I think that, so that's the good side, is that you can sometimes just have a very strong passion around something. The flip side is, I think, if we think about the profile of what is considered typically an entrepreneur, at least when I was in business school, it's typically somebody who's younger, who's male. I was a single mom at the time who doesn't have, these things called children that might get in the way of your work, all that good stuff. So if I had judged based on like, do I look like that person, therefore am I interested in that career, the answer would have probably been hell no, So I do think that it's a very, no pun intended, interesting thing you bring up that I think we need to think about a little bit more, because interests and motivations themselves may then introduce a new sort of biased lens that we'd have to think about.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting that they're...
And I think that this happens also in software engineering or other fields that are very male dominated, right? Is that, if I take my 13-year-old, she's actually quite good at coding and stuff like that, but the challenge is that she looks at the people that are in those classes or whatever, and they're all boys. And then she's like, oh, I'm going to peace out because, I want to go hang out with some females. And so that's, I think, one of the more challenging things around what we do is how do you actually, so we can unbias an algorithm, but then how do we sort of unbias reality so that it becomes more appealing to groups that are underrepresented?
I have run into that exact example. A good friend of mine started off in CS, and it wasn't that she was overly challenged by it or anything, but after about a year and a half, she was like, I just got tired of being the only woman in the class.
And our general counsel right now, Avital, is in the same boat. And again, we found a lot of similarities actually between lawyers and software engineers in their trait profiles. So that's just something, if you're thinking about something different down the line, Dan, but she said the same thing. She was like, I was really good at computer science, but I just got sick of all of the not extraneous, but all the sort of reality of what that meant on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, there's a lot of sort of assumed baggage that goes along with that.
Well, and real baggage sometimes, and not just assumed,
Right.
And we've all been, and again, even when I became an entrepreneur, it was shocking to me because I went from being a neuroscientist, which, isn't 50-50, but it's like, probably, it's probably 1/3, 2/3, something along those lines, right? And so you feel, and same with an MBA program, it's kind of a, it's the same ratio, and then you go all of a sudden to being, literally this in the single digit club, as they say, and it is shocking at first. You're just like, wow, how did this happen? And do I really want to be here? And eventually, I think what was appealing to me was the ability to create a company where we don't just, help everyone find their fit outside of Pymetrics. We try to do the same thing within Pymetrics, and we try to have that distribution of people be unbiased from a gender and ethnic perspective, right? So to be able to create that for the company was very appealing. But that didn't mean that, in a group of CEOs or in an investor group or whatever, that wasn't, oftentimes the single digit problem rear its ugly head. I think there are a lot of things that we're doing societally to try to change that now.
Right.
But you know, it's again, it's easier to unbias an algorithm than it is to unbias the reality that we all live in. You know, so.
Yeah, I think that's very, very true. I think that's very true. Well, thank you so much for joining
Absolutely.
us. Coming here from a lawyer who is now going to go off and teach himself Python.
You seem pretty happy in what you're doing, so I'm not recommending that.
Okay, all
I was
right,
just saying,
all right.
if you have,
but it's an option.
It's an option.
There.
You know,
it's out there.
I mean, I think that's the other thing is like we change careers so often now. Like this whole notion that we're going to stay in one career for like the next 60 years is just so dated, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that this whole idea of the Harry Potter sorting hat. Is critical, not just for those millennials, but for the rest of us that may want to do different things along the way.
Do new and different stuff.
Exactly. Keep us on our toes.
Great. Well, Frida, thank you so much
for
joining
us.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this segment. Please stay tuned and follow us at the Think Tank at #AdobeTT.